A few months ago, I got a call from Sonia. Sonia is someone that I knew moderately from social media. We hadn't really had much of an interaction, but she had signed up for a marketing platform that I recommended. And she had a friend signed up. Friend, the friend needed some guidance. I spent a couple of hours one Saturday helping. Sonia called me later because she was concerned that I had spent all that time and she hadn't known it would take that much time. And my response to her was, don't worry about it. It was fine. I was delighted to do it. I'd do it again. Somehow, we then got into a discussion. I learned that she was a coach, and she started asking me questions about what she had been doing in her coaching practice. And one time she asked me something, and I said, well, that would be an opportunity to tell a story because stories help you establish credibility. That's one of the things we talk about in the selling boot camp. And we went on, and another opportunity came up. She asked me something else, and I said, no, I think that you were on the right track there. Perhaps if you would have done whatever. Once again, that's something we talk about in the selling boot camp. And conversation went on for about a half hour. At one point in time, she said, Dan, I have to stop you. During this conversation, either inadvertently or on purpose, you've mentioned the selling boot camp. What is that? And I explained it's a boot camp for introverts or others who are not comfortable selling, where we help them learn how to use the traits that we share as introverts as superpowers. And I explained a bit more. And she said, well, how much is that? And I told her, and she said, I'd like to sign up for that. Terrific. So we signed her up. And before we went further, she said, but actually, I have a question. Do you talk about closing in the boot camp? And I said, well, of course we do. But before I explain that, let me ask you a question. How did you like this conversation we've been having? Oh my gosh, Dan, it was great. You helped this and you did this, and it was wonderful and you're inspiring. And I said, yeah, I appreciate that. I certainly enjoyed it as well. And you closed. And there was this silence. And I finally broke the silence. And I said, you asked me how we close. You closed in this conversation. That's how we close, with conversations. My wife, overhearing me tell people that I'm an introvert, is astonished. She said to me one time, you can't be an introvert. You talk all the time. Which I didn't know how to receive, but I assumed she meant well by it. But I said, it doesn't mean being an introvert doesn't mean we can't talk or that we can't have conversations. It's just in a group of people, for example, I would rather talk one-on-one with an individual than to spend 10 or 12 minutes chatting with 8 or 10 people in the group. That's how introverts feel. But we can certainly have conversations. Well, guess what, ladies and gentlemen? What is a sales presentation normally, if not a one-on-one discussion with someone about a subject you are both interested in? That's one of the ways our superpowers as introverts offer us value. Frankly, what we teach in the boot camp is a system that extroverts can benefit from as well. But extroverts get away with things because they're extroverted. Because, like Ms. Miriam, they come into a meeting and it doesn't matter where we are, they're excited and they take over. And it's wonderful to watch that in action when it's done well. As an introvert, I can't do that. I actually went to a business networking meeting that was free form where I needed to make contacts. And I was so uncomfortable. This is the truth. I asked my wife, who's very outgoing, to come with me so she could be my wingman. And it worked beautifully. She would meet the people and introduce me. And I was delighted because I didn't have the comfort of engaging. 2 or 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Sumpta Abidjanam, I believe is her name. I know it's her name. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And two other wonderful women entrepreneurs talked about selling. And it was a delight. Miss Assumpta helped me understand how, as an introvert, I can now engage without my wife as my wing person, we call it in America, my wingman. She talked about how what you do, and I encourage all of you to think about this, what you do is wait to achieve eye contact with someone, smile, and she has the most beautiful, radiant smile, and then compliment them. And that typically begins a conversation. That's an example of the kinds of things that offer us as introverts and others the ability to engage, to institute an engagement with someone with whom we want to speak. But then what do we do? What do we do when we have that engagement? Well, in my mind, we have a conversation. And there are two types of conversations in my mind. There is the conversation that you know is a selling situation, and the other person knows is a selling situation, and it's a directed conversation, directed to creation of a sale. And there's other conversations that are undirected. Those also can lead to a sale. I remember one of the gentlemen in my boot camp was talking about how I'd helped him so much so that now he was engaging in ways he hadn't before. In one case, he was sharing how he'd been to a wedding celebration and he was talking with someone at the table in a way he wouldn't have ever done it. And I asked him, what kinds of questions did you ask? Well, as kids and so on. I said, why could you not just as easily have asked what his business is? Why could you have not asked probing questions in this undirected conversation that lead down a path where you could have the opportunity to do as I did when I mentioned selling boot camp to Sonia? I don't know whether I did it inadvertently or on purpose. I do it because it's a part of me and because I know it offers value. So why, I said to him, didn't you follow that? That would have been just as engaging. He would have been just as open about that. And you would have learned something that could benefit you. So there's an incredible salesperson who's on social media whose name is Dan Henry. He is an extrovert beyond, but he's an incredible salesperson. I can't sell like him. I don't want to sell like him. I want to sell to people who have needs. So does he, but he's a little more pushy than I am. But by having conversations, as he points out, every conversation I have is a selling opportunity. So I want you to think about conversations that way, just as easily in an open-ended, undirected conversation, for you to inquire of people about things that could lead to an understanding of a need they have that you can address. But with directed conversations, here's how you do that. And there's a book I'll refer you to. It's called The Introvert's Edge by Matthew Pollard. I was introduced to it by my chiropractor, who makes me seem extroverted. And Pollard has written a 7-step process that anyone can follow to be better at sales. But as introverts, we need a process. We're not the witty joie de vivre, tell them jokes, slap them on the back, take them to dinner. That in an extrovert's mind is very easy. And while we may want to do the same things, take them to dinner, we need to approach it differently. And the 7-part system, which is part of my boot camp, I got from Matthew Pollard. So there are a couple of really important ingredients to your directed sell. And you use them in an undirected sell equally well. But first of all, you want to establish a rapport. You know, the concept of know, like, and trust. People need to know you so they can learn to like you, so they can come to trust you. Because from credibility that you develop in a know, like, credibility mode comes trust. So you want to create a rapport that will enable you to engage and then lead to them understanding your credibility. There are a number of ways to do that, one of which I'll address here. The second thing you want to do is set an agenda. All right, Dr. Sumi, I'm so pleased we're here together. I would like to ask you a few questions along the lines of what we discussed so I can better understand who you are and what you're up to Is that okay? Very important. No one will say no, but you must ask, is it okay? And when they say yes, the third step is to ask probing questions. And by probing questions, I don't mean, if you're selling retail, for example, I don't mean, how is your day going? I mean, what is it that prompts you to come in today? Are you attending a celebration? Are you going to a wedding? Are you looking for everyday clothing? Or if you're coaching, you don't say, how did you like working with your last coach? You would say, what is it about your last coach that left you feeling wanting? What wasn't achieved? We're obviously here talking about coaching because there's something about what I do that you and I both think might work for you. What is it about your prior coaching experience that didn't fulfill you? That's a probing question. So establish a rapport from which you can build trust, set the agenda so that while you're asking questions, if they say, well, what about the price? You can say, I don't really know enough yet to answer that question. The price depends a lot on what your needs are, and I haven't yet understood those needs. So let me proceed, and we'll certainly deal with those things later, because by the probing questions, and the next point I'm going to tell you, which is telling stories, you will establish a higher value for what you do, the credibility and the trust, so that maybe they don't want to pay your price, maybe they can't pay your price, but they will rarely question whether you're worth the price if you've handled this part of the questions and the stories appropriately. There's a woman that's a professor at Stanford Business School. I happen to prefer listening to her because that's my alma mater as well. She has done research for over 20 years on stories, and her research has concluded stories can be up to 22 times more effective than facts alone. Think about that. 22 times more effective. There's another professor at Princeton, a very reputable, high-quality school in America, whose name is Dr. Uri Hassan. He has put electrodes on the heads of people who are telling stories and on those listening to the stories. The same part of the brain that lights up in the head of the storyteller is the part that lights up on the head in the brain of the listeners. I mean, that's as close to mental telepathy as I can imagine. So when you're talking with someone, I'll use coaching as an example, and they say, I'm having a difficult time selling, and my queries would lead to I've tried it and I've humiliated myself, and I'm just scared to try again. If that were the pain point, I could say, I can fix that for you, but that doesn't get to it. How about this? I have a client who I worked with 4 or 5 years ago, who's still a client, who had the same issue as you. He had tried to sell because he needed to, because as an entrepreneur, we all have to sell. But he had failed and felt very ill at ease in the conversation because someone asked him a question he didn't know the answer to. As a result, he was then uncomfortable selling, just like you. We work together in the selling boot camp where we do a lot of peer-to-peer role play and a lot of role play with me, so that years ago when I was first starting in business, someone asked me if I wanted to join Toastmasters, and I said, what's Toastmasters? And he explained it's a place where you learn to speak. And I too had been humiliated. I said, no, it's not going to happen. I don't want to do that again. And he said to me, but wouldn't you rather be humiliated in front of people who understand rather than waiting and being in a situation where it really matters? That changed my life. I was in Toastmasters for 12 years. That's what we do when we do role playing. We work with people who are all ill at ease, just as I did with this gentleman. And we worked together for 8 weeks. I talked with him afterward. He's gone on to be uber successful, and now is recommending me highly. Now, how much more credibility do I have when I tell that story of someone just like my prospect who is now in the same place because of what we did together? So the process of the directed conversations is establish credibility, set the agenda, ask probing questions to identify pain points, and tell stories. That's the process. Now, in an undirected, I'll conclude with this point. There's a gentleman named Eric Schultz, who I heard speak and whose book I bought. He was the interrogator that interrogated prisoners that brought Saddam Hussein, resulted in the capture of Saddam Hussein. He was in Iraq for 3 months, and he finally got the last bit of information that located Saddam as he was heading to the airport to be redeployed back home. What he started doing was what he learned in Army interrogation, which was basically didn't create a rapport, and he found out that people didn't talk. Then he said, well, maybe I'll start building a rapport. Started relating to people a little more. They related to him, but they lied. That didn't work either. Finally, he said, you know what? I'm just going to get to know these people. I don't have an agenda. Got to know people, and they started and continued telling him things because he was a friend and they trusted him. That led to the capture of Saddam Hussein. When he came back to America, the Secretary of Defense asked him to set up a program with 30 people to help them learn how to do it his way. What happened is, before, when the Army interrogation method was used, about 4% of the time, good information was derived from people interrogated. After using Eric's method, 60% of the time, they got nuggets. 60% versus 4. So I've had situations when I've tried the directed selling and for whatever reason ran up against a roadblock that I needed, that I didn't feel there was a way to get past, but I continued talking because I love getting to know people. And I closed people both times when at the end they said, you know what? I really do think I want to sign up for the selling boot camp. I had not even talked about it, but I had built that rapport and that trust. So as you go forward in your selling, I strongly encourage you. When we think about selling as introverts, it's this big, daunting, impossible cloud in the sky that hangs around people who just know how to sell, pervades them with insights and the knowledge. It's not that. There's nothing magic. They make it seem like magic because they have personalities that are different than ours. Once again, ours being anyone who's uncomfortable selling. The solution is a conversation. Open opportunities to have conversations, as Mrs. Sumpta says. Engage in conversations. Ask the right questions to see if it's directed in a way that leads you to develop a sale. And if not, don't walk away. Continue talking for a bit. Worst case, you get to know someone. There's never anything wrong with that. So that's my message to you. Keep in mind one word: conversations.